Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're gonna be reviewing Stained Glass Stories by the band Cathedral.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
It is late and it is the fourth video I'm recording today, and for some reason I can't get myself to say things in a way that most people say things. You see, like this sentence, it's not the way you say things in English. Anyway, I'm getting my mind confused, but I really want to get this video made, so here are some of my favorite bits from this album.
The first image come to sight out of time.
So in 1975, a band called Odyssey broke up, and from its remnants came up a new band called Cathedral. Now, right as we get into this band, I should tell you all, is somewhat of a copycat band. I think that's not something I should be ashamed of saying. These guys, they tried copying the sound of Yes and Genesis and various other bands, and it plays a big part in the music that's found on here. And if you know this album, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and if you don't know, you can give it a listen and understand what I'm saying. Now, something within me tells me that this first album by theirs, called Stained Glass Stories, is copying a lot of the great bands, but if they would have moved on to create more albums, they might have created their own unique sound, which would have been the Cathedral sound. But unfortunately, they didn't get that chance, because seeing as this album was released in 1978, prog was already on the decline by this point, and it was declining very rapidly, and suddenly it was harder for newer bands to create more progressive rock albums. So despite them starting to work on a second album, it never really materialized to anywhere. The recording company didn't support them enough, and the band had to disband, and this band unfortunately broke up in the same year of 1978. And this album that we're reviewing today, their debut album, was actually their only release for a long while, until they reformed in the 2000 and released two new albums, one in 2007 and most recently in 2020. But when it comes down to it, Stained Glass Stories is considered to be one of the OG hidden gems in progressive music, and a lot of people that do stumble upon it think that it's pretty great, despite it copying a lot of different majestic bands. And the reason I'm saying majestic is because the band themselves actually referred to the big bands of the 70s as the Majestics, being King Crimson, Yes, Jethro Tull, Gentle Giant, Genesis, and so on and so forth. Note that I have excluded Pink Floyd because these guys weren't really influenced by any psychedelic or spacey sound, but rather more of the symphonic prog sound. Now, from doing my research, I've seen that a lot of people really like this album, but to me personally, it kind of didn't tickle me in the right places. It was fine, it was nice. At certain points I thought that it was fine and good. Some points were higher, but honestly, all in all, this is a pretty standard copycat album that, you know, zigzags between Yes and Genesis mostly. And you know, the influences are so felt on this album. There's so little, you know, creative juices from Cathedral themselves. It seems like they're always trying to impersonate someone else, that I actually broken down this album to the 5 separate tracks, seeing which two bands were the most influential in the inspiration for each and every one of the tracks. So to me, the first track, called Introspect, sounds like King Crimson and Yes. Gong actually sounds like Yes and a bit of Gentle Giant. The Crossing sounds like a very interesting crossing of Jethro Tull and Genesis. Days and Changes sounds to me a lot like a combination of Yes and Genesis, and The Search also sounds to me like a combination of Yes and Genesis, but taken down an octave lower. Now, I'll be perfectly honest with you all. For once, I kinda didn't really find anything with this album and find it pretty disinteresting. And two, I don't really have a lot to say about this. I'm like really biding my time over here. So most of what I'm gonna say from this point onwards will be some of my personal opinions of this album, which there are not a lot of, and I think this one will be a slightly shorter than usual review, but that's okay. And by the way, I've finished just a few hours ago seeing Scott Lade from the Prog Corners video about his top 20 obscure prog albums, and mine was there, which is something which I'm really happy about, but also this album was actually there in one of the top 5. So Scott, if you're watching this video and you think that my opinion about it isn't as good as yours, well, you'd be right. I don't like this album probably as much as you do. And this applies to anyone watching this video. If you really like this album like many other people do, well, I don't like it as much. I think that it's kinda, lame. It just kinda tries to copy things without sounding original like at all, and it just kinda didn't interest me. And I think that the main issue with this album is how perfectly it sits on this very crumbly and unstable middle ground. So on the one hand, it sounds so much like all of these other bands that I've pointed out that it doesn't really sound like anything that is Cathedral. Just the name Cathedral, to me at least at this point, brings to mind every single other band besides Cathedral themselves. And on the other hand, they do copy a lot of the bands, but they never reach the same greatness as any of them. So despite me hearing a lot of Genesis influences and Yes influences on here, at no point in this album do I feel like the music is as good as these other bands. And I am not someone to say that I don't like copycat bands. I really love some of those acts like Atmosphera, which copy Yes shamelessly, or even Marillion, which kind of copy Genesis, but they all sound really good to me. But the problem with these guys in Cathedral, they just couldn't really nail anything, and they stood on a middle ground that to me at least created an album that is really disinteresting. I'm saying really disinteresting, I'm not really meaning really disinteresting. It's still music that I enjoy, and it's symphonic prog, which is probably my favorite subgenre of prog, so it was kind of fine, but at the same time it really quite didn't interest me at all. But at one point I kind of actually liked this album more, and it was specifically on the 4th track called Days and Changes. This one was pretty enjoyable from start to finish, but if I had to pinpoint it down and tell you what I really liked about this one, it has to be the Mellotron. I know, it's just one instrument and this is an entire track, but I really love the Mellotron. It's one of my favorite instruments of all time, and they utilized it much like you hear on albums by Genesis, especially Foxtrot. And if there's one thing which I really liked, is the section where they actually had their own custom tapes on the Mellotron singing this male vocal, which sounded really cool. It wasn't like anything I'd expected to hear, but it just shows you how complex of an instrument the Mellotron is and how far you can go with it when you actually try. And I was hoping that this hype would continue on to the next and last track called The Search, but unfortunately that just didn't happen, and the album ended off leaving off a very indecisive experience. Again, this cover, really much like the album, stands on a middle ground, and really odd middle ground of certain bands. So you have the aesthetics of an album like Lark's Tongues and Aspic, but at the same time you have some scenery which looks like Roger Dean scenery, but the drawing itself looks like a Paul Whitehead drawing. If you don't know who Paul Whitehead is, he's the person who made covers like Foxtrot and Nursery Crime. And the thing about all of those elements, none of them are as good as the originals, much like the music on this album. I think the thing I like about this cover the most is actually the text of the name Cathedral. Like, that's the thing I like about it the most, maybe the shade of red. But when that's your favorite thing about a cover, you know a cover isn't really doing its job. So this album will receive a very generous 7 out of 10 because deep within me I still believe that there's a chance I'm gonna open up to this music a bit more. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be listening to the album called Gun by the band The Gun. This is gonna be one of those earlier albums before the '69 year, so it's gonna be something very proto-progish and very interesting. I of course want to thank my lovely supporter over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Walnum, you are the best. And if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch y'all tomorrow. Bye, guys.